What happens when a carefully orchestrated public relations appearance goes completely off the rails in front of millions of viewers? The answer lies in one of the most uncomfortable television moments ever captured, where a polite morning show pleasantries transformed into a masterclass in passive-aggressive confrontation that left everyone watching wondering if they had just witnessed career suicide in real time. If you want to see how this unfolds and witness one of the most cringe-worthy interviews in television history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think went wrong here, because trust me, you are going to have opinions about this. The morning started like any other at the Live with Kelly and Mark studio. The familiar set buzzed with its usual energy as crew members made final adjustments to lighting and cameras. Kelly Ripa sat poised in her signature style, radiating that effortless charm that had made her a daytime television staple for decades. Beside her, Mark Consuelos embodied the steady, dependable presence that balanced their on-screen chemistry perfectly. Today's guest list promised the kind of ratings gold that network executives dream about. But nobody could have predicted the television train wreck that was about to unfold as the cameras rolled and the familiar theme music faded. Kelly's professional smile widened. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Live with Kelly and Mark. We have such an exciting show for you today. Her voice carried that practiced enthusiasm that morning television hosts perfect over years of early call times and caffeine. Fueled energy? Mark nodded in agreement, his own smile genuine but measured. That's right, Kelly. Our next guest has certainly been making headlines lately, and we're thrilled to have her here to set the record straight on a few things. The audience applauded as their guest made her entrance. Meghan Markle walked onto the set with the poise of someone accustomed to being in the spotlight, though today something felt different. Her smile seemed slightly more forced than usual, her movements just a touch more calculated. She wore an elegant cream-colored blazer that screamed expensive but understated, the kind of outfit chosen specifically to project competence and relatability. Simultaneously, Meghan, welcome to the show, Kelly said, rising to greet her with the customary air kisses that daytime television demanded. Thank you so much for having me, Meghan replied, her voice carrying that carefully modulated tone she had perfected during her royal years. It's wonderful to be here with both of you. As they settled into their seats, Mark leaned forward slightly, his posture suggesting this was going to be more than just another promotional softball interview. So Meghan, let's dive right in. You've been quite vocal lately about various causes and issues. Tell us what's been keeping you busy. Meghan's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that suggested she was already calculating her responses. Well, Mark, as you know, I've always been passionate about using my platform to amplify important voices and create meaningful change. Whether it's through our foundation work or various media projects, Harry and I are committed to making a difference. Kelly's smile remained fixed, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was already several moves ahead in whatever game was about to be played. That's wonderful, Meghan, but I have to ask, and I think our viewers are curious about this too. There seems to be quite a bit of contradiction between wanting privacy for your family and constantly being in the media spotlight. How do you reconcile those two things? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan's perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the slight tightening around her eyes. I think that's a bit of an oversimplification, Kelly. There's a difference between choosing when and how to share your story versus having your privacy invaded by tabloids and paparazzi. We've always maintained that we want to control our own narrative. Mark exchanged a quick glance with Kelly, the kind of silent communication that comes from years of working together. Control the narrative, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. That's interesting phrasing, because from where many people sit, it seems like the narrative has been pretty consistently controlled to position you and Harry as victims, even when the circumstances might suggest otherwise. The studio audience fell silent. This was not the gentle celebrity puff piece they had expected. Meghan's composure remained intact, but her voice carried a slight edge when she responded. I think that's quite unfair, Mark. We've never positioned ourselves as victims. We've simply shared our truth about experiences that were genuinely difficult and, frankly, sometimes traumatic. Kelly leaned back in her chair, her expression maintaining that perfect balance of journalistic curiosity and daytime television friendliness. Your truth is such an interesting concept, Meghan, because the thing about truth is that it's usually pretty consistent. But when we look at some of the statements you've made over the years, there seem to be some, shall we say, evolving details. Not sure what you're referring to, Meghan replied, though her voice had lost some of its earlier warmth. The careful media training was starting to show cracks. Well, for instance, Kelly continued, in your famous interview with Oprah, you mentioned feeling suicidal and having no support from the royal family. But then we learned that you had actually sought help from the Human Resources Department, which isn't exactly the same as having no support available. It's more like the support that was available wasn't the kind you wanted. Mark picked up the thread seamlessly. And then there was the whole thing about your wedding. You told Oprah that you and Harry had a private ceremony in your backyard, 3 days before the big public wedding, but the Archbishop of Canterbury later clarified that what you had was essentially a private vow exchange, not a legal ceremony. The legal wedding was the one the whole world watched. Meghan's carefully maintained composure was beginning to show visible strain. I think you're misunderstanding the context of those statements, she said, her voice carrying a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. When you're dealing with intense emotional situations, sometimes the way you remember and process events is different from how others might interpret the technical details. Kelly's eyebrows rose slightly, the expression of someone who had just heard something particularly interesting. So, are you saying that your emotional state affected your ability to accurately recall events? Because that's quite different from the confident way these stories were initially presented. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted dramatically. What had started as a routine morning show interview was transforming into something much more confrontational. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they should be uncomfortable or entertained by this unexpected turn. Mark leaned forward again, his voice maintaining a conversational tone despite the pointed nature of his words. Meghan, I think what's concerning to a lot of people is the pattern. It's not just one or two inconsistencies. When you look at the timeline of various statements, interviews, and public appearances, there seems to be a consistent theme of facts being, let's say, flexible depending on what narrative serves you best at any given moment. Meghan's media training was fully engaged now, her smile returning but lacking any genuine warmth. I find it interesting that you're focusing on perceived inconsistencies rather than the broader issues I've been trying to highlight. Issues like mental health, awareness, racial inequality, and the treatment of women in the media. Oh, we absolutely appreciate those causes, Kelly said, her tone dripping with the kind of sweetness that anyone familiar with morning television knew was actually quite dangerous. But don't you think that when someone positions themselves as an advocate for truth and authenticity, their own relationship with truth becomes relevant to the conversation? The question landed like a precision strike, and for a moment, Meghan's carefully constructed facade flickered. Her hands, which had been resting comfortably in her lap, shifted almost imperceptibly, fingers interlacing in what body language experts would later identify as a classic defensive gesture. I think you're conflating separate issues, she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. My advocacy work stands on its own merit, regardless of how the media chooses to interpret my personal experiences. Markle wasn't about to let her off that easily, but that's just it. Meghan, your personal experiences have become your brand. The victim narrative, the claims of being silenced, the allegations of racism within the royal family, these aren't separate from your advocacy work. They are your advocacy work. So when the details of those experiences don't hold up under scrutiny, it calls everything else into question. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter as Meghan's composure continued to crack. I never said I was silenced, she protested, though her voice lacked conviction. I said that I wasn't being protected, which is completely different. Kelly's smile could have cut glass. Actually, you did use the word silenced multiple times. In fact, in your interview with Oprah, you specifically said that there were conversations about how you couldn't continue to live like this, that it was all happening just because you were breathing. You painted a picture of someone who was being actively suppressed and prevented from speaking out. But here's what's interesting about that. She paused, letting the tension build in a way that only seasoned television professionals know how to do. You had your own social media accounts before joining the royal family. You had relationships with journalists and media contacts. You had a platform and a voice. The royal family didn't take those things away from you. You chose to give them up as part of accepting your new role. So when you say you were silenced, what you really mean is that you didn't like the constraints. That came with the position you chose to accept. Meghan's jaw tightened visibly. That's an incredibly reductive way to look at a complex situation, she said, her carefully modulated tone beginning to slip. When you're dealing with an institution that has centuries of protocol and tradition, individual agency becomes much more complicated than you're making it sound. Mark nodded as if he was considering her point, but his next words showed he was just setting up another attack. You're absolutely right that it's complicated, which makes it even more puzzling that you and Harry have consistently presented these complex institutional dynamics in such black and white terms. The royal family is racist, full stop. The media treatment was unfair, full stop. There was no support available, full stop. But reality is messier than that, isn't it? What are you suggesting? Meghan asked. And for the first time, her media training seemed to completely abandon her. There was genuine anger creeping into her voice now. Kelly leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. We're suggesting that maybe, just maybe, some of the challenges you faced had less to do with racism or institutional cruelty, and more to do with the fact that joining the royal family requires a fundamental shift in how you approach public life. And maybe some of the resistance you encountered had less to do with your race or your background, and more to do with your apparent unwillingness to accept that shift. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable and had entered territory that felt almost dangerous. Meghan's eyes flashed with something that looked like genuine fury before she managed to rein it back in. I find it fascinating, she said, her voice dripping with barely controlled sarcasm, that you would sit here and essentially gaslight me about my own lived experiences. You weren't there. You didn't experience what I experienced. You didn't have to deal with the constant scrutiny, the isolation, the complete lack of support when I was struggling with my mental health. Mark's expression remained infuriatingly calm. You're absolutely right. We weren't there. But neither was Oprah. Neither were the journalists who wrote the sympathetic profiles. Neither were the millions of people who accepted your version of events without question. The only people who were actually there were you, Harry, and the members of the royal family and their staff. And here's the thing, Meghan, some of those people have started to speak out. Not publicly, not in dramatic television interviews, but through carefully worded statements and strategic leaks. That paint a very different picture of what was actually happening behind palace walls. Meghan's composure was hanging by a thread now. Strategic leaks, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. You mean the same palace machinery that spent years protecting other members of the family while throwing me to the wolves? The same institution that somehow managed to keep other scandals quiet but couldn't be bothered to correct false stories about me. Kelly's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of someone who had just been handed the perfect opening. That's interesting that you mention other scandals being kept quiet, because that's exactly what institutions do, isn't it? They protect their own. But here's the question that I think a lot of people have been wondering about. If you understood that the royal family operates by protecting the institution first and individual members second, why did you expect to be treated differently? And more importantly, why did you seem so surprised when the same protective instincts that you're now criticizing for being applied to others weren't automatically extended to you? The question hung in the air like a trap that had just been sprung. Meghan opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find an answer that wouldn't make her situation worse. Mark's